Whereas, to me, it's self-evident that what I would call neoclassical, but we now, you know, the popular sort of terminology is neoliberal, how wrong it is, how it doesn't deliver any outcomes that are desirable. But the question I've asked myself is why did, you know, I thought in the early days of the global financial crisis that was it for that paradigm, that it was going to basically be so discredited that it had had its run, 33 decades, it was ended. And we were going to see some sense again, that this set of body of literature and thought and narrative didn't work at all. But I was wrong, it's persisted. And so, you know, the challenge for me as an academic was to try to come to terms with how the bloody hell does this decrepit non-knowledge persist to parade as an underpinning for economic policy which damages the majority of us. And so I got involved in this research agenda on framing, which comes out of social psychology and linguistics and the use of language. So that's sort of the background. My co-author Louisa Connors, this is her contribution to the project, is to understand the way in which humans develop what they think as being conceptual understandings of things. And you know, it's almost over my head, which is a perfect statement to illustrate the way in which we physically embody concepts. Things we don't understand are over our heads. It's a physical way of understanding something, of coming to terms with something out there. And a lot of our thought is unconscious, that we actually end up with a whole series of inconsistent propositions that are mutually inconsistent, and we don't even know that. And so you've got the Tea Party in America running around proposing all sorts of things that undermine their own prosperity, for God's sake. And they don't even know it. Most of the way in which we understand abstract concepts is through the use of metaphorical language. And so, you know, the idea that we understand something, that something we don't understand is over our heads, that's a metaphor. That something more is good and less is bad, and more is up and less is down. And fiscal deficits appeal to us because a deficit is something that's down, it's less. And the way in which the mainstream economics persists in its dominance, its intellectual dominance, which, you know, it's not very intellectual at all, but the way it parades and maintains its dominance, is because it strings together a series of linked myths and then buttresses them with a series of metaphors that are known to appeal to the way in which we relate to our external world and our framing of reality. So this is just a small sample of the sort of metaphors that are used by neoliberal media and economists and policymakers. You know, living beyond your means. You've all heard of these in various ways. You know, the metaphor is living beyond your means. Well, the intent of that is to engender a sentiment that there's something excessive going on, that there's some sort of sacrifice that's needed, and that cuts are needed because you can't live beyond your means. You know, spending like a drunken sailor. Our treasurer in Australia is always talking about government spending like drunken sailors. Well, you know, wanton irresponsibility. And so if you relate that metaphor to public spending, you've immediately got a negative response because of the way we think of that metaphor. And, you know, I could go through them all, but you know, mushrooming fiscal deficits. You know, something that's mushrooming out of control, just popping up like Topsy at the slightest inclination. You know, ballooning deficits, out of control, something's just going wild, and so on and so forth. There's every day you'll see these in the financial media. You'll see the highest politicians in all of our countries using these metaphors, and they have a strict intent to undermine the public's confidence in macroeconomic interventions by governments, to undermine the confidence that we might have and the trust we might have in governments that seek to challenge the so-called self-regulating private market. And it's a body of theory that has no evidential basis, that is internally inconsistent as a theoretical body. You know, I could talk about that for years. It's a body of theory that has theoretical inconsistencies, has no real evidence base, yet it dominates because of the use of the language and the metaphors that buttress it and support it. And that type of way of conducting narratives in the public policy debate sucks progressives in, because they then get locked into debating in the same metaphorical space, as if a national government like the British government can run out of money. How can the British government that issues the pound run out of pounds? It's like saying that they've got to stop the test match at Lord's. Well, they could. The Lord's was a good one. At Edgbaston, because the scoreboard had run out of points to put up on the scoreboard. And you know, when you confront progressive politicians and their think tanks or whatever, they say, well, we've got to talk like this because it's the real politic. And so they come out with things like, we've got to balance the budget over the cycle, which apparently makes them look reasonable. It just makes them look like dopes. That we've got to tax the rich to pay for infrastructure. Well, no, you don't. The savings of the rich have got no relevance to what a government can do to advance public welfare. You might want to tax the rich for equity reasons, but you don't need to get their money. That's sort of like saying that Ayn Rand was right in her book that we all rely on the hard work of the entrepreneurs. Well, no, we don't. That's playing into the neoliberal metaphorical story. Or we've got to tax the rich to improve the services of the poor. Well, no, you don't. If a national government wants to provide better services to the poor, it's got the wherewithal because it issues the currency. You might want to tax the rich if you want them to have less money to spend, but that's for a separate motive. That's nothing to do with giving you the wherewithal to help the poor improve their access to public services. And by buying into this so-called real politic, I get told all the time by progressive politicians, etc., or their advisors, oh, Bill, you're just an academic, you know, we're out in the real world doing politics. And I turn around and say to them that by buying into this metaphorical space, you're reinforcing it and you're giving yourselves no options to ever break out of it. And that's why movements in Britain like New Labour are so destructive. Now, fortunately, they're proving themselves to be irrelevant, I think, but for a long time they've undermined the progressive agenda by basically reinforcing these neoliberal narratives. Now the other thing that Louise O'Connor's taught me was that this concept of construal. And this is this idea that for a time we can be locked into a particular set of perspectives on something and have these metaphors continually reinforcing them through the news and the media and the politicians all talking this nonsense. But we have capacity as human beings through our cognitive processes and our understanding and use of language. We have the capacity to change the way we view something if we're confronted with a different set of metaphors and a different language. We can construe the same event that we thought about in one way today in quite a different way tomorrow. Now, to me, that's a very significant thing, because progressive politicians and their economists have to understand this essential principle of language and social psychology and start leading again. Start developing leadership by allowing people to construe things in a different way, by using different metaphors and using different languages. And that's why it's so damaging for a so-called progressive politician to get up and say, well, I'm going to cut the deficit too and balance it. Well, why the hell would you want to balance the fiscal deficit? Who said that was a good idea? When you've got an external deficit and you want your private sector to start saving and they're over indebted, how the hell do you think you're going to get a budget surplus? Whoever told you that that was appropriate policy? And then they look at me and stare, and you know they haven't got a clue. They're just aping the language of the neoliberals because they think that that's what the population thinks is fiscal responsibility. But this is a population that has been poisoned by these ridiculous metaphors to construe something in a way that's totally erroneous and has no application to evidence or reality, but serves an ideological agenda of a very small proportion of our population and undermines the prosperity of the majority. I think that's where I'm going to finish. This is from John Maynard Keynes. I like this quote. The conservative belief that there is some law of nature that prevents men from being employed, that it is rash to employ men, and remember this was written in the 1930s, so it's the genders, we would improve on that now, and that it is financially sound to maintain a tenth of the population in idleness is crazily improbable. The sort of thing which no man could believe who had not had his head fuddled with nonsense for years and years. So the point was that in the 1930s, we construed things quite differently because the language was different and the metaphors were different. And so, you know, I don't know when, but if the progressive side of life and the manifestation into progressive politics gets smarter and stops supporting parties that talk about balancing budgets, then there is hope to manipulate the construal capacity in human understanding to really achieve a progressive end. And that's sort of what I guess I'm devoting my academic life to. Thanks very much.